Sports Talk Chicago. Herbert Jon Zaghloul, and we are back and ready for today's special guest. He's the CEO of MuellerFootball.com, host of the Football GM podcast, and the 2000 NFL Executive of the Year. Please welcome Randy Mueller to the program. Randy, it's great to have you on. How are you?
Thanks, John. I'm doing great. Looking forward to a little downtime here before we get things cranked up again for NFL football.
What do you make of the Bears draft, first off?
Well, it's hard. It's a tough position to be in. I was in the same role when I went from Seattle to New Orleans. They had given away a first-round pick as well. So our first pick was, I want to say, third or fourth pick in the second round. So it's hard. And I Ryan Poles has a tough job. It's hard to acquire assets. It's hard to team build when you don't have all your options available to you. So you got to make the best of it. So, hey, he did what he thought was right. I'm sure the guy who they picked, whether in the second round or the third round, those guys were high on their board, and their whole process kind of led them to them. It's his first time through, though, so you never know how things are going to work out. And it's hard to start without a first round pick, but hopefully they make the best of it.
How surprising were the first two picks to be defensive guys and not offensive weapons for Justin Fields?
Well, I think in this draft, and maybe there was some strategy behind that. There were a lot of, like you said, offensive weapons picked in that first round. Maybe their intel told them that they could get one in the third round. I happen to really like the kid from Tennessee. I think he's a really good player. He's really fast, and game-changing impact speed is hard to find. And I think the fact that they found it in the third round is great. I do like the first two picks. I think the kid from Washington, Gordon, he wasn't the more highly acclaimed of their two corners at University of Washington, but what they do there is they play multiple schemes, John. They play multiple techniques. And the one thing Gordon did show to me, now he's not as smooth as the other kid, not maybe as dynamic athletically, but he showed me ability to play press, to play off, to play bail. He plays a lot of different techniques there, and they've done a really good job there in producing corners the last really 10 years. And I think that will benefit him. They're not wired into a one scheme or one technique player with him. So I liked his versatility. I think it adds to what they're doing defensively. Matt obviously wants to play a multi-front scheme and probably some multi-faceted coverages as well. And I think Gordon does that. The Penn State kid, Briskin, I think that's a little harder for me because it's not an impact position. It's a safety per se, and I'm not degrading safeties at all, but it's hard to really build from your inside out in that secondary. I think corners are more prevalent, receivers more prevalent, tackles more prevalent, and they didn't do anything along those lines. So I watched the kid from Penn State. I think he's at times a box safety, but more suited to be a free safety. So I think it depends on fit with him. And I don't know what they're going to ask him to do, but before we judge the pick, I think we've got to see the defensive scheme and see where he lines up, because some of his skill set is going to be really dependent on what they do with him once he gets to Chicago.
How much of an impact do you expect any of these guys to make this year as rookies?
Well, I think Velus Jones is going to be hard to keep off the field. When I watched him, I got excited about what he does. Now he's raw, and he's going to have to learn how to run routes. He didn't run a full route tree at Tennessee, but when you see him run by people time after time, and he's so dynamic that he'll make a guy miss on a slant pattern and run 60 yards for a touchdown. That's something that I haven't seen out of the Bears, especially the last few years. They've been a methodical kind of plod their way up and down the field, and this kid's going to open that up for him. Plus, he's going to help their running game as well. So I think it's a group to start with. Their hands were tied a little bit cap wise leading into the draft. Now this, no first round pick, that never hurts. Never helps. So it's going to be a process for Ryan Poles and his crew. I think it's one that they're going to have to get comfortable with each other. There's always a learning curve when a new regime takes over. So I just think it's going to take a little time and patience. And you know how that is, John. Nobody has any or wants to spend any on that. That's for sure.
You think he's done a good enough job, though? As you said, he came in with no first-round pick, and there is a cap situation for the Bears. Do you think he's done well considering the situation he inherited?
I think he's done as much as he can. Time will tell. I don't expect the Bears to challenge for their division. I really don't. He didn't make a bunch of volume of moves. you have two ways you can do it when your hands are tied like his were. One, you can go out and redo some contracts and make some room for a splash or two signing. They didn't do that. The other way is you can sign some one-year guys, some guys like Pringle, the receiver, on one-year deals, those kind of deals. And that's where they elected to go. They've some short-term investment just to get them through next year. I think the plan to rebuild really won't come into full focus for the rest of us until next year, or at least through next season's offseason.
Is that the right strategy that Poles picked? Do you prefer this one to the other one, which is clearing up some cap space and making one or big two signings?
No, I like this route. I think the route is commendable. I think it does take patience. I think it's hard for a first-time GM. I think he's settling into the job too, and that's going to take some time. People forget this happens a lot in the NFL now. These younger guys get these jobs, and they've been a step or two removed from being in the big chair in the past, and it changes things. It's different. It's easy to play a GM on Twitter or in the social media world, but when you get in that chair, it's totally different, and the dynamics are different. You forget, oh yeah, I didn't have time to watch film at all last week. What do I do with my time now? So I think everybody has to adjust. Matt Eberflus is going to have to adjust. It just takes time. So I think the job they've done so far is fine. I guess the results will, they probably hope that they can win 8 or 9 games this year. That would be a successful year for them. But I think you got to look toward the future before you judge on what they're doing. That's for sure.
What's something we don't know about GMs?
Well, the biggest thing is that you sit around in a closet and pick players. You might do that as a scout, or you might do that as a college director or something like that. There's a difference between evaluating players and valuing players. And that's the big thing a GM has to do is he's got to listen. He's got to value players. He's got to decide, does it make sense to take a safety in the second round? Even though the impact on our big team build may not be there, we don't know what the other options were. So when he made that choice, depending on where their board was and how they had stacked players, it's a different game. It's not fantasy football. You have to, I think the other big thing about a GM, especially a young one, is you have to be a consistent listener and communicator throughout the whole building. And these are tasks that I think have been really hard to judge for new GMs going into new buildings, because you don't know what kind of people skills they have. You can't really judge a lot of how they're going to be when they're under the gun. You've seen them operate in a vacuum by evaluating players or picking a certain player here or there. They've never been involved in a team build. So that it's completely different. And it's who can adjust to a lot of the changing dynamics, who can still listen to everybody in the building, to communicate with everybody in the building. You become a glue guy. You go from sitting in a closet picking players to being the glue guy in the whole building. So it's a giant step up. And I think most people don't understand that about being a GM.
How'd you adjust to that when you were a GM?
Well, I was lucky, John, because when I left the Seahawks, I had been there 17 years, and I really had been in charge for 4 or 5 years before that without the title. So I got to, the on-the-job training without the accolades, without a title, without all the arrows and bullets coming at me. So from behind the scenes, I could kind of mold myself as a GM. So when I went to New Orleans, I also hired a coach in Jim Haslett that I was very familiar with. I brought Mickey Loomis with me, who's been the Saints GM for a long time now. So I brought 5 or 6 guys with me that really helped me. And even though it was the first job I had that was a title of GM, it was really the second time having been through it. So I think it's easier to come up in one organization and work your way to the top, like happened, for example, with me in Seattle, before you jump ship and go somewhere else. I think it's hard to jump ship and start in a role that you've never had before. That's the hard part.
Randy Mueller is still here on Sports Talk Chicago. Randy, what do you make of the Bears draft in relation to Justin Fields? Did the Bears help him in this draft?
Well, I think they're helping him because they're building their team out in their fashion. It still comes down to if you evaluated players or not correctly. And so that will determine how much help Justin Fields gets. I think sometimes in the outside the building world, it becomes about picking a particular player to help a quarterback. Or I like the phrase everybody always talks about, well, we're going to build around the quarterback. I got news for you. We're building around the quarterback every year. and every pick and every acquisition. I don't care who the quarterback is. He's the focal point, and we're building around him. So I think that's going to happen to them. I'm not going to put too much emphasis on this, but the Jones kid from Tennessee helps Fields. Trust me. He's going to help their running game. He's going to help a lot of, because people are going to have to know where this kid is. That's 4.3 speed that is hard to find. And people have to defend you different. Even if they never throw this guy the ball, John, and he's going deep all the time, they got to defend you different. So I think that helps Justin Fields. I'm not the biggest Julian Davenport fan, but he'll be functional for what they want to do. So you'd like to say, well, they drafted a tackle or they drafted, a superstar receiver or running back. That's just not the way the real world works. Sometimes the help is behind the curtain and people won't see it until they get out there in September. So I don't think they kicked, Justin Fields to the curb and not, put parts around him. I think they have. I think they were limited because they've had to pick these parts with one arm behind their back.
How big of a jump do you expect for Fields next year?
Oh, I think it'll be a good sized jump. Now, they may not win many games. That's going to be the hard part. But I think as you grow in your trade, you've got to develop thick skin. You've got to be able to handle adversity. He kind of did that in his first year. Now let's see where he goes. He's way ahead of where he was last year. Trust me, just the speed of the game alone, John, is going to make things easier for him. He knows his role. I realize he's learning a new offense, but he's comfortable in his own skin now. He had no idea what he was getting into last year. Trust me, from the day he showed up, he went from the dock of the bay to the Autobahn. Now he's at least going from the freeway, to the Autobahn. So it's a total different jump. And I think he'll be better because of it. Again, comfort, confidence, all of that will come to be determined if the personnel around him allows him to go much further. But him in learning his trade, he saw coverages, he saw things that were expected that he had to adjust to, that he didn't know he was going to have to do. He didn't do that in college. So there's a lot to grow in your trade, even in a tough environment that he had last year.
What's going to be your criteria in judging his progress? You're going to look at numbers, record, or how do you see it? I
don't think you can judge his record because I think there's going to be a lot of missteps around him still in the first year of a new regime. I think you've got to judge. Here's what I would judge him on. I judge him on confidence. I would judge him on accuracy of his throws and how he feels in the pocket. Instead of running like he did last year often, let's see how he operates and if he's more comfortable in the pocket. Defensive coaches keep you in the pocket eventually, and that's going to happen to him. As great of an athlete as he is, it's happened to Michael Vick, it's happened to Steve Young, it happened to them all, right? Eventually, they have to beat you from the pocket. So we'll see where he advances there. Can he anticipate and make throws on time better than he did last year? So there's a lot of ways to judge him, but overall, I think his leadership, his demeanor, his character within the locker room, all those things should be a step up from last year. We'll see how that shakes out.
How confident are you in the new coaching staff to deliver for him?
I don't know him well enough. I think that would be a disservice for me to judge on guys that I don't know. I just think that in this day and age, change is good, and change is part of every building in the NFL now. We'll see. It comes down to what you say is one thing, but can Matt and his crew make a difference on Sundays? And I don't know that. We'll have to see how that maps out. What you've been through there the last 3 or 4 years, that wasn't making a difference on Sundays. Let's just see if Matt can make a difference on Sundays, and you'll be able to tell. Fans can tell, players know. So we'll all be able to see it, in front with our own eyes.
Did you ever have a situation like that when you were GM, maybe a coach and a QB didn't get along? Did that hurt the team?
Oh, it would definitely hurt the team. I don't recall a specific, situation like that. And I wasn't really aware of all the dynamics then. I don't think a relationship that was in Chicago really factored into that team's success. I think there were so many things going on and so many levels of, I don't want to say chaos because that's being disrespectful, but so many levels of football acumen lacking that, I don't think you'll have that at this point. And I think it behooves Fields to get on board with these guys and buy in right from the start. If his career is going to traject up, he's going to have to buy in. And I think that's good for both sides.
Randy Mueller still here on Sports Talk Chicago. Randy, a few more questions before we finish up. First off, the Titans. So I saw your tweet about Ryan Tannehill. It was not the consensus opinion on Twitter, so I really wanted to get your take. What do you make of his comments about helping out Malik Willis?
I don't think it's a player's job or worry. That's not his. And he's not saying he's not going to help him. I thought the content was taken out of the realm of really the whole question and what it meant. People criticized him. Here's the thing. This is professional football. It's not AAU basketball, right? Everybody shows up to work. They punch the clock. They do their job. I don't need Ryan Tannehill to be the mentor for anybody. If that's what we're relaying, if that's the message, we're messed up as an organization. So we really don't need that. We need Ryan Tannehill to play better than he did last year. And that's all I'm worried about. So Malik Willis, he was a third-round pick, right? We're building this kingdom around him like he's Joe Montana. Let's just let it play out. We'll see if he deserves a chance to play. Hey, if he comes in and he's the best guy, he's going to play. Trust me, John Robinson, Mike Vrabel, they want to win. They're going to play the best guys. But I don't think they're banking on Ryan Tannehill to mentor him along the way. There's been many a third-round picks in the NFL. Some have gotten help from their teammates, and I'm sure Malik Willis will. Others have had to fight through some things on their own. I'm sure Malik Willis will have to do that. So I just thought it was way too much made out of really an innocent comment, and I don't think any harm was meant by it, nor if I was the GM would I really have any concern with it.
How do you think the Tennessee Titans do this year with Tannehill? Do you think he improves, or do you think at some point maybe Willis does take over?
I don't think Malik Willis is ready for prime time. So he would have to make an enormous jump in my mind to be an NFL player. I think he's probably even further than Trey Lance was last year, in that I think he's a year away from being a year away, if that makes any sense. So he's got to develop a whole new process by which he shows up every day, what he learns every day. The learning curve is steep. I think people on the outside forget that these are the best players in the world. And just because you were a decent player in college doesn't mean you're going to be a good player in the pros. That has zero to do with it. It's really about your skill set and the scheme you get thrown into and how you develop. So first thing Malik Willis has to do is learn what's going on. You'll never develop as a player. I don't care if you're the left guard or the right defensive end or the quarterback. You'll never develop if you don't know what you're doing. So he's got to learn that first. And I just think it's way too early to project him. I do think it's actually an advantage for him to be a third round pick if the media and everybody else will allow that, instead of saying he slid out of the top 10 picks, because I don't think on most boards he was ever in the top 10 picks. So, that's just the way NFL people see these college quarterbacks, so to speak. So we'll see. I think he has high ceiling, Malik does, because of all the skill sets, but he's a long way from being an NFL quarterback.
Randy, before we finish up today, last question. Your best draft as a GM was what?
Well, there's I'm trying to think of the one I remember most was probably the simplest. We had one time in Seattle, the 9th and 10th pick in the first round, and we were able to make deals and swap around to turn the 9th and 10th pick into the 3rd and 6th pick. And the 3rd pick, we picked Sean Springs, and the 6th pick, we picked Walter Jones. So that's pretty hard to top, I think. A Hall of Famer, maybe the best lineman to ever play, and a perennial Pro Bowl corner in Sean Springs from Ohio State. So somehow we weaseled and finagled and made a couple deals, and luck was on us that day. So that's one that's hard to beat. I always go back to that one, I guess.
Randy, thank you so much for joining me. Always a pleasure to have you on. Best wishes moving forward, and looking forward to the next time we chat too. I'm sure there's going to be a lot to talk about.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it. Good to be with you.